Sandringham House, Norfolk, 6 February 1952. The winter light over the Sandringham estate comes up slowly in early February, gray and flat across the frozen Norfolk fields. A valet entered the king's bedroom at around 7:30 in the morning and found George VI in his bed, unresponsive. He had been out the previous evening, walking the estate grounds with the gamekeepers, and had retired, apparently well. By morning he was gone. He was 56 years old, and he had been unwell for years, a lung operation the previous September, a general physical decline that had alarmed his doctors without alarming anyone into genuine preparation. And still the household wasn't ready for it. Death in a palace is still a shock. The message that reached Kenya took time to arrive. Princess Elizabeth, 25 years old, was at a treetop lodge in the Aberdare Forest, watching elephants at a waterhole below as the African morning came in. Her husband Philip took her aside and broke the news. She became queen at the moment of her father's death, which had already been some hours earlier, on the other side of the world. Those present later described her as pale but composed. She collected herself in the manner of someone who had been trained since childhood for precisely this kind of demand, and the party began the journey home. Back in London, in the palace that had been her parents' home since December 1936, a 51-year-old woman had just lost her husband, her title, and her house, in that order and in quick succession. The house was the part that nobody writes about first, but the house was the part that was going to take a fight. The rules of the British monarchy are clear and old and merciless. When the king dies, the palace goes to the sovereign. There is no written statute that says so, no specific law passed by Parliament. What exists is something older and more powerful, a convention so settled that it had not required codification for a century. The reigning monarch occupies Buckingham Palace, the official London residence of the British Crown since Queen Victoria moved in permanently in 1837. When that monarch dies, the new one moves in, and the widow moves out. She had been queen consort for 15 years, from December 1936, when her husband Albert became George VI after his brother's abdication, until the morning the valet found the king unresponsive. 15 years is long enough to stop feeling like a role and start feeling like a person. Buckingham Palace wasn't merely where she lived. It was the physical expression of everything she had built across those 15 years. The court she had shaped, the staff who answered to her, the position that placed her at the absolute center of British royal life. At dinner in the palace estate rooms, there were pages behind every chair. The social machinery she had assembled ran through her, and she knew it. And she knew that what she was being asked to give up wasn't simply a building. She had arrived at Buckingham Palace as an unlikely queen, the Scottish earl's daughter who had twice refused the Duke of York's proposals before finally agreeing in January 1923 because, as she said, she loved him. She had spent the Blitz refusing to leave London while the palace was bombed 9 times. The worst incident destroying the chapel while the king and queen were in residence, the bomb falling in the courtyard close enough to shatter the windows. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she told the press afterward. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." That line, delivered in the rubble of her own house, was the making of her public image, the queen who suffered alongside her people. After the war, that image cashed into an institutional authority more durable than any formal title. As of February 6, 1952, the senior royal woman in England was her 25-year-old daughter, and everything built inside those palace walls now belonged to someone else. The title changed within days. She announced it herself, that she now wished to be known as Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. The phrasing was hers. She kept the "the." She always kept what she could. The precedent for what came next was set 42 years earlier. When Edward VII died on the 6th of May, 1910, his widow, Queen Alexandra, moved to Marlborough House as her London residence, a transition that had been arranged during Edward's lifetime, because Marlborough House had been their base as Prince and Princess of Wales for decades. The new king, George V and Queen Mary took Buckingham Palace without crisis. The pattern was established. The widow moves. The sovereign moves in. The institution continues without interruption. Alexandra's case actually made the convention look easy, because Alexandra had an existing emotional home to return to. Her London life had been centered on Marlborough House for years before Edward died. The 1910 transition followed a pre-existing logic. Queen Mary, who became the Queen Mother's own mother-in-law, had repeated the pattern years earlier, departing Buckingham Palace for Marlborough House when her own husband, George V, died in 1936. She remained at Marlborough House until her death there on the 24th of March, 1953. The machinery of succession was old, and it knew how to run. In 1952, the woman who was supposed to step into it declined. The place she was expected to move to was called Clarence House, and the best that could be said about its status was that it sat on the right side of the mall. Built between 1825 and 1827 by the architect John Nash, the same man who had overseen Buckingham Palace's transformation from townhouse to royal palace, it was designed for Prince William, Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, who had pressed George IV's household for years for a London home more suitable to his rank. Nash produced a stucco classical structure adjacent to St. James's Palace, airy enough, well-proportioned, comfortable by any reasonable standard, but it was, in the clearest architectural sense, a private residence rather than a sovereign's headquarters, a home rather than a center of power. Buckingham Palace has 775 rooms. It's the official administrative headquarters of the Crown, the building from whose balcony the royal family acknowledges the crowd at every moment of national importance. The ceremonial weight of the place isn't incidental to its function. It's the function. Clarence House had no equivalent institutional gravity. It was the property you were given when the main prize belonged to someone else. There was also a specific irony built into this particular handover, one that wouldn't have been lost on anyone involved. For the 3 years immediately before George VI's death, Clarence House had been the London home of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. They had moved in during the summer of 1949, after 2 years of renovation that Philip had personally supervised, adding modern features including an up-to-date speaker system, while Elizabeth's contribution to the decorating process was characteristically practical. When people complained about the new paint smell, she told the workmen to put a bucket of hay in the room to absorb it. Their first child, Prince Charles, had celebrated his first birthday in the Clarence House nursery in November 1949, surrounded by aristocratic toddlers and a rum-tinged birthday cake with one orange candle. Princess Anne was born at Clarence House in August 1950. Contemporary descriptions of the house under Elizabeth and Philip called it pastel-colored, brightly lit and cheery, a family home built around children and informality rather than state occasions. What the Queen Mother was being asked to do, in other words, was accept her daughter's recently vacated house as her consolation prize. She was being moved down one residence on the institutional hierarchy and handed the keys to a building that still held the warmth of someone else's domestic life. The step down wasn't subtle. Nobody intended it to be. Her response to this situation wasn't concealed. When Parliament raised objections to the cost of her planned redecorations at Clarence House, she sent her view through her household in terms that leave no ambiguity about her mood. She wanted them told how little had been done to the house and how small and horrid it was. She complained loudly and specifically enough that the complaining became its own kind of statement. The Queen Mother never complained without a purpose. The Royal Collection Trust records that the Queen Mother moved into Clarence House shortly before the coronation in 1953. The coronation of Elizabeth II took place on June 2, 1953. That places her arrival at Clarence House in approximately May 1953, roughly 15 months after George VI died on 6th of February 1952. The royal household's own records aren't entirely consistent on this point. The official biography page on royal.uk states that she moved in 1952, while the Clarence House page and the Royal Collection Trust both specify 1953, the most precise single documentary source. The Royal Collection Trust's direct account of the house's occupants is the 1953 figure. 15 months is the best documented estimate for the duration of the delay. Shawcross frames the period primarily in terms of grief and the practical requirements of preparing a house that had recently been vacated by its previous occupants. Royal residences routinely require substantial work between occupancies, and Clarence House was no exception to that pattern. Both explanations for the delay, genuine grief and genuine logistics, are real and documented. Grief alone, however, does not explain the timelines of Alexandra or Queen Mary. Alexandra managed her 1910 departure without a comparable delay. Queen Mary, in her mid-80s by the time of her death in 1953, had arranged her own removal from Buckingham Palace almost immediately after George V died. The Queen Mother was 51, in full health, with a household staff and the considerable resources of the Crown at her disposal. What the record shows is a woman who moved on her own schedule and whose schedule was considerably more relaxed than the institution's. Into this situation stepped the man with the most direct practical stake in its resolution. Philip had lived at Clarence House from 1949 to 1952 as Elizabeth's husband. He had supervised its renovation personally, turning a dilapidated residence, no central heating, primarily gas fixtures, no modern bathrooms, into a functioning family home. He had made it the place where his children's earliest years happened. With Elizabeth's accession on 6 February 1952, the two of them needed Buckingham Palace, the sovereign's official London administrative center, to function as the operational headquarters of the new reign. The Queen Mother's continued presence there wasn't an abstraction. It was a daily, visible obstruction to the normal operation of the monarchy. Philip wasn't a man who waited out obstructions with equanimity. His biographer Giles Brandreth characterized him as a naval officer who believed institutions should run on schedule and according to clear logic, and who found the elaborate social courtesies of the old court both baffling and wasteful. Brandreth's assessment of the dynamic within the new royal household was blunt. Elizabeth wore the crown, but Philip wore the trousers. Whether or not that captures their private dynamic with complete accuracy, it captures the received image of Philip in those early years, decisive, impatient, and committed to dismantling habits he found inherited from a world that had ended. The Queen Mother represented, for Philip, a specific concentration of those habits and a specific source of competition. The historian Jane Ridley characterized their relationship as a tug-of-war for the ear of the new queen, with the Queen Mother positioning herself as the guardian of established protocol, and Philip reading that positioning as a direct challenge to his own authority within the family. The tension had biographical roots that predated the standoff over the palace. Philip had married into a family that didn't, initially, consider him a natural fit. He had no independent financial standing. He was, by birth, a Greek-Danish prince with 4 sisters who had married into German aristocratic families, 2 of whom were members of the Nazi Party, not a minor social complication in the Britain of 1947. Marion Crawford, governess to the royal princesses, noted that some of the king's advisers considered Philip not good enough for Elizabeth, calling him a prince without a home or kingdom. Later biographies, including Philip's own Wikipedia article, recorded that the Queen Mother initially referred to him as the Hun, a reference to those German family connections, though she later told the biographer Tim Heald that Philip was an English gentleman. The shift in characterization probably reflects genuine evolution of feeling and certainly reflects her gift for revising inconvenient history. The family broke up, Philip told Brandreth about his own childhood, the dispersal of his parents. The sisters married off to Germany. His mother placed in an institution with a diagnosis of schizophrenia when he was 9. He had grown up across 3 countries, educated wherever relatives could afford to place him, without a stable home from the age of 18 months when his family was exiled from Greece. His relationship with the British royal family's culture of accumulated comfort and ancient precedent was always that of someone who had arrived from outside it. The documented friction between Philip and the Queen Mother surfaces most clearly around their competing visions for Prince Charles. Philip wanted his son at Gordonstown, the Scottish boarding school known for Spartan physical conditions and resilience building, where Philip himself had been educated in the 1930s under Kurt Hahn. The historian Piers Brendan characterized Philip's position as wanting to make a man of his firstborn son through exposure to difficulty. The Queen Mother, by contrast, believed Charles needed what she called delicate nurturing, sympathy, and understanding, and she wanted him at Eton, conveniently adjacent to Royal Lodge in Windsor, which was one of her own residences, and embedded in the social world she understood and had spent decades cultivating. Philip prevailed on the Gordonstoun question. The Queen Mother didn't stop influencing Charles. She simply shifted the terrain on which she did it. At the 1953 coronation, the ceremony that marked the formal end of the transition period and Elizabeth II's establishment as sovereign, Brandreth noted that Philip overplayed his hand. The specific nature of the overplay is less important than the pattern it suggests. A man extending his influence slightly past what circumstances would tolerate and occasionally finding himself managed by people who had been navigating this particular institution for considerably longer. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been navigating it since she married Prince Albert at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. She had 30 years of advantage on him. She used them. Philip's specific role in the Queen Mother's departure from Buckingham Palace isn't documented in any name biography. His formal authority as consort didn't extend to directing the housing arrangements of the Dowager Queen. Those decisions were formally the sovereign's, meaning ultimately Elizabeth's. He appears in the story not as a recorded antagonist, but as a highly plausible one, a man with documented impatience, documented friction with his mother-in-law, and a direct practical stake in her moving. Whether he communicated his frustration to his wife in the direct, blunt manner entirely characteristic of him, whether he had any specific role in the timeline, none of this appears in the written record in a form that can be cited as established fact, which is where the heating story enters the picture, arriving without documentation, but with remarkable persistence. The account has circulated in palace-adjacent circles for decades without acquiring a named source. The version most commonly repeated runs roughly as follows. Philip, having exhausted his patience with the delay, arranged for the central heating in the Queen Mother's Buckingham Palace apartments to be turned off. The palace was already cold. Buckingham Palace has a long and well-documented history of being cold. In Queen Victoria's time, the chimneys smoked so badly that fires had to be allowed to die down, leaving the building's rooms at the mercy of whatever the English winter offered. Victorian accounts of the palace describe the ventilation as poor and the general condition of the building as inadequately suited to comfort. The suggestion embedded in the heating story is that someone made the building colder still, on purpose, in a targeted and deniable way, until continuing to occupy it became untenable. It's an almost perfect story. It's petty in the precise way that a naval officer would be petty. Not a confrontation, not a scene, just a quiet, practical adjustment to the environmental conditions that allowed the problem to resolve itself without anyone having to be directly unpleasant. And it reduces one of the most formidable women in 20th century British royal life to someone who can, in the end, be moved by a thermostat. The story does not appear in William Shawcross's official biography. It isn't in Giles Brandreth's account of Philip and Elizabeth. It isn't in Philip Eade's Philip biography, not in Ben Pimlett's The Queen, not in Sally Bedell Smith's Elizabeth the Queen, not in Hugo Vickers's Queen Mother biography. No palace staff memoir available in print contains it. No named source in royal journalism has attached their name to it in any verifiable form. It's palace lore, widely repeated, emotionally persuasive, passed through comment threads and family conversations, and the kind of confident assertion that appears in YouTube comments with 317 likes. None of that makes it feel untrue. Some stories are too emotionally accurate to simply dismiss on evidential grounds. The heating story gets something right about the dynamic, even if it can't be confirmed as an event. It captures Philip's temperament, the Queen Mother's stubbornness, and the peculiar domesticity of a power struggle that was, at its core, about who got to sleep in which set of rooms. The question of authorship, Who gave the order, who would even have the authority to give it, is one the story never quite answers, because answering it would require naming someone, and the people involved weren't going to do that. What can be established? The Queen Mother didn't move until sometime around May 1953. The family around her weren't encouraging her to take her time. She arrived at Clarence House approximately 15 months after her husband's death, approximately 3 weeks before her daughter's coronation, with the redecorations she had described as inadequate and Parliament had complained about nonetheless completed. Whether the rooms at Buckingham Palace went cold before the movers arrived is a question the biographies decline to answer, and probably decline for reasons. The simplest explanation for the 15-month delay is grief, and it deserves to be taken seriously before it's set aside. George VI had died at Sandringham on the night of 5th of February and was found the following morning. There was no apparent suffering. He had simply gone in his sleep, alone, while his household slept around him. She had been watching his health deteriorate for years. The lung operation in September 1951 had removed his left lung entirely. He had been advised to cancel the Commonwealth tour he had been planning. She had known, in the way that a spouse knows without wanting to know, that this was coming. And still, the actual morning was different from the knowing. His private secretary later described her as keeping the rooms at Sandringham where the king had lived as shrines, exactly as he left them, an image that carries its own weight and tells you something about the shape of her grief. The smoking room, the sitting room, the particular arrangement of objects that had been his. She didn't want the rooms changed. That is documented. What the biographers read into its grief, what the wider pattern of her behavior makes plausible, is also the refusal of someone who wasn't ready to let the institution tell her that the ending had already happened. She had been queen consort for 15 years. From the abdication crisis of December 1936 through the wartime bombing and the post-war reconstruction and the slow darkening of George VI's health through the late 1940s and early 1950s, the queen consort has no constitutional power. She supports the sovereign spouse and holds no independent authority. But she had something that outlasted formal authority: social weight, institutional memory, and a position at the center of the family's working life that had been built over 15 years of relentless, careful effort. The queen consort's power is the power of proximity, of a woman who knows where everything is and why it matters and how the machine runs. Losing that wasn't the same as losing a job title. Stephen Tennant, who knew her, offered a description her official biographers wouldn't have chosen. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Harold Nicholson called her the greatest queen since Cleopatra. Cecil Beaton called her a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Both descriptions locate the same paradox: the extraordinary softness of the surface, the extraordinary hardness beneath. What 1952 demanded of her was giving up the center, not gradually, not on her own terms, not with adequate time to find a new form of importance, but immediately, structurally, because the convention required it. Her daughter was queen. The queen got the palace, and the title created to mark the distinction said everything it needed to say. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She had been the queen. The new construction acknowledged her seniority while subordinating it. She retained the style, Her Majesty. She retained the word queen, but the "thee" in her new title, which had once meant she was the only one, now served mainly to distinguish her from the woman who had replaced her. She chose the title herself. A few days after George VI's death, she announced that she wished to be known by it. There was no other title worth choosing, and she would have known that before she announced anything. The pattern that established itself in those 15 months didn't stop when the movers arrived. If anything, the move clarified the pattern by completing its first cycle. She had conceded the building, having established, in the process, exactly how much she was prepared to concede and under what conditions. Prince Charles, in the consistent account of his biographers, experienced Clarence House as an emotional refuge from the more formal atmosphere of his parents' household at Buckingham Palace. He was close to his grandmother in the specific way of a child who finds in one adult the warmth that other adults don't quite provide. She understood the sensitive, artistic boy more readily than either of his parents appeared to, and she made herself the person he turned to for consolation. This wasn't incidental grandmothering. It was the deliberate cultivation of an emotional bond that gave her a specific form of soft power over the succession, sustained through Clarence House across the following decades, independent of her daughter's household. Charles visited Clarence House constantly. He was, by the account of multiple biographies, her favorite grandchild. And favorites know they are favorites, which is itself a form of influence. The Margaret Townsend situation illustrated a related habit. Peter Townsend, a former RAF officer who had served in George VI's household, continued in the Queen Mother's service through the mid-1950s. Princess Margaret had fallen in love with him during the period when he provided comfort after her father's death. The constitutional problem was clear. Townsend was divorced, which, under Church of England rules in 1955, made a royal marriage impossible without Margaret surrendering her royal status and income. The Queen Mother was Townsend's employer, the person most immediately positioned to exercise influence over the situation. And yet, as Hugo Vickers recorded in his biography, on the night when Margaret returned to Clarence House, after a final emotional encounter with Townsend, her mother had already set off for an evening engagement at the University of London, unaware or unconcerned that her daughter would be having dinner alone on a tray. The Queen Mother had a gift for being absent at the precise moment when her presence might have required her to take a difficult public stand. She kept the warmth and company when they cost her nothing, and she kept her own comfort when they did. Meanwhile, Clarence House had become something that Buckingham Palace, as an administrative headquarters and state ceremonial center, never was. Genuinely enjoyable. Commentators consistently described it as a court within a court, interpretive language rather than a formal designation, but accurate to the social reality. Buckingham Palace was where the business of the sovereign happened. Clarence House was where people went when they wanted to have a good time. The parties there were famous for 3 decades. The dinners ran late. The cocktail receptions were heavy with gin. The loudspeaker system she had installed, the kind usually found only in betting shops, as Shawcross noted, relayed minute-by-minute racing updates from tracks around the country. She read the sporting life every morning over breakfast, and she ran up losses at Ascot that alarmed the people who managed her accounts. "I have lost all your money at Ascot," she wrote to one treasurer, per the Shawcross biography. "I hope you don't mind." Her sense of the relationship between royal dignity and personal financial restraint was, to put it charitably, relaxed. She wrote to Princess Margaret about one particularly memorable evening at Clarence House, a cocktail party for 200 Anglican bishops who were visiting from overseas. By the time that 8 o'clock came, she wrote, per Shawcross, they were in cracking form. They tucked into all the canapes and tossed down martini after martini. This was the Clarence House she had built, a place where even 200 bishops loosened their collars by 8 in the evening. Running the social machinery of the establishment was William Talon, known throughout the household as Backstairs Billy, who served as the Queen Mother's personal steward from the 1950s until her death. He mixed the cocktails. He managed the mood. He handled the staff with a combination of camp authority and evident devotion, and he described his own job with the directness she apparently appreciated in him. "When the lights go on in Clarence House," Talon said, "it's showtime." Guests described her during those years as arriving to her own parties, sparkling with diamonds, in pink tulle crinoline, exuding, as one account had it, an excited joy that was almost unqueenly. Almost, never quite. She outlived Queen Mary, who died at Marlborough House on the 24th of March, 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation. After Queen Mary's death, the Queen Mother became the family's senior woman, the matriarch, as it was described, a role she had in practice been exercising from Clarence House since she arrived. She outlived George VI by 50 years exactly. She died on March 30th, 2002 at Royal Lodge in Windsor, still at one of her own preferred residences at the age of 101, 7 weeks after her younger daughter Princess Margaret had died on 9th of February. In the year 2000, on her 100th birthday, the crowds outside Clarence House ran 4 deep along the Mall. A military band played. She appeared on the steps in a blue hat and waved. She had been queen consort for 15 years and a dowager for 48 more, and by any fair accounting, the widowhood years were the reign. The standoff of 1952 and 1953 wasn't widely narrated at the time, and for most of the decades that followed. Shawcross's official biography didn't appear until 2009, 7 years after her death. The silence that has always protected the working of the royal family's internal dynamics kept this episode in the register of inference rather than documentation, which is largely where it remains. The grief narrative is the one the official record prefers. It isn't wrong. Grief was real, and grief was present, and it would be both cheap and inaccurate to pretend otherwise. But grief does not fully account for 15 months. It does not explain describing Clarence House as small and horrid. It does not account for the energy and speed with which she turned her enforced new residence into a rival point of gravity within the royal family. Not a consolation prize, but a base of operations from which she exercised influence, entertained on a grand scale, shaped the next generation's emotional loyalties, and managed her public image with the precision she had always brought to managing everything. And it does not explain the persistence of a story. Without documentation, without a named source, passed across decades in the spaces where palace knowledge has always circulated, that someone eventually found a more direct way to resolve the question of the rooms and their temperature. Whether that someone was Philip, whether the story is true, whether the apartments actually went cold, the biographies are silent. The anecdote persists because it's emotionally accurate in a way that documented history rarely is. Philip was impatient. The Queen Mother was immovable. The palace was cold. She left eventually. The gap between those facts and the heating story is where palace lore has always lived, and the distinction between the lore and the record matters. Not because one is interesting and the other isn't, but because conflating them would destroy the credibility of what the record actually supports. What the record supports is the shape of the episode and what it established. One woman, one building, one convention she was expected to observe. Approximately 15 months in which she declined to observe it on anyone else's schedule. She left Buckingham Palace in the end. It took over a year. A step down to Clarence House, an exasperated son-in-law, and if the palace stories are to be believed, a deliberately cold set of rooms. But she only ever conceded what she was forced to concede, and not an inch more. She gave up the building. She didn't give up the spotlight, the court, the place at the center, or the refusal to be told no. Not that year, and not for the next 50. The Queen Mother's first act as a widow was to make her own daughter wait for her own house. It was the most honest thing she ever did, and almost nobody outside the palace knew it was happening. Subscribe for more stories like this.